My practice is rooted within Cornwall and the south of England, where I kind of grew up. And my work, I was going to say, lies within kind of the slashes of kind of research-led interdisciplinary social practice. And often my work, or predominantly work, is kind of co-produced in collaborations with communities and places. I work with kind of a multi-layered range of materials, processes and actions, which kind of span dialectic performance, assemblage, sculpture, installation and social practice. So often my work involves creating kind of forging long relationships with places and people. So in order to kind of make large scale projects that help connect kind of the landscape to people and each other. My more recent work is taking the form of like public programs, creating works that kind of marry my love of archaeology, botany and geology, and kind of explore the human experience through my own kind of rural, queer, neurodivergent lens. So ongoing projects, so this is kind of slides from the last year or so of different projects. Ongoing projects kind of involve digging into the expansive complexity of kaolin mining with local community members within the China clay landscape in Cornwall, reinvigorating a 4,500-year-old social network of clay and food, unique to kind of the Lizard Peninsula within Cornwall on the southwest. And what I'm here to talk about today, which is kind of untangling the story of 628 non-native flowering plants and ferns in a 1 kilometre kind of grid reference. So these are kind of different pictures to kind of show my practice is predominantly, socially engaged and outside. So this was kind of the beginning of the project maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where I just started going out into the landscape and kind of exploring the space that was there. So through talking with Maddie, we kind of discussed different projects. I thought this particular project that I initiated in like 2017-18 would be an interesting one to explore, mainly because of the challenges and the fact that this project is very much in like the deep expansive research phase. So usually I wouldn't really talk about projects at this stage because they are so convoluted. Just to kind of open up conversations at this stage comes from that. So as Maddie kind of explained, the project is called SX0753, which is the grid reference for 1 kilometre 1 kilometre space in Pearl Harbor on kind of the coast from where this is here. And I really kind of liked that title because it's kind of like an arbitrary code, which both signals kind of the exact location, while also kind of giving nothing away about that place, unlike kind of particular place names, which are normally tied to like human-centric histories or specific histories. So far I have kind of 5 years research into SX0753. And the kind of multi-layered systems that come together to make up this landscape. So that included exploring kind of the deep time formation and geology of the space, and then the mineral deposits from there. Over 4 years, I kind of explored the 6,000-year history of human occupation and landscape manipulation within this landscape. And then also the ancient and current trade routes. And then on top of that, the 250-year expansive history of China clay mining, and then the effect on that of the communities and culture on the landscape. And all of that kind of leads towards the journey and story of these plants. So I was first drawn to kind of Pearl Harbor in 2017-18, when I kind of heard, which Maddie kind of spoke about, was this kind of fact that since 1999, 535 non-flowering plants and ferns have been identified in that 1 kilometre grid reference. And to me, that was kind of like, I needed to understand more and understand how they got there. I knew that it was predominantly through the kind of the China clay industry, but didn't really understand more than that. So coming back to kind of this picture, this kind of explains kind of a bit of this landscape, but it's a 70 kilometre space that over 250 years has been mined for kaolin. And in that time, 1.8 billion tonnes of earth has been kind of moved, shifted, and largely sold and transported globally. So what kind of started out as like a small project to see if I could understand some of the stories of these plants turned into a project on more of like a global scale, which is exciting, convoluting, and really challenging. These plants so far, and kind of, this was my submission for Mater, the plants so far have kind of were directly linked to kind of 27 global locations, and not the plants themselves, but the stories of how they came there. So through the granite that was originally mined within the area, the copper, the tin, the transport links up to the Mersey, through Swansea, through Rotterdam, Norwegian wood. There's kind of all these relating kind of like locations, and on top of that, over 40 other materials have kind of come through this research so far. So a lot of my work is kind of understanding landscapes. I wrote a little while ago, asking questions of the landscape I no longer ask myself. I think by attempting to define a landscape, my definition and boundaries of what a landscape are growing. Like a landscape kind of revealing and hiding itself as you traverse through it. Like you'll never reach the horizon. It's kind of this all expanding story. So for Mater, I was interested in telling like not a linear story of this. I think because the research is so expansive at the moment, and it isn't really a point of becoming really public or working with people. And I think the idea of kind of like history and landscape are not really linear things, and the way kind of thoughts created as well. And a lot of my research has been looking around the way my own brain maps things. So I was interested to go out that kind of took the viewer on a journey. As I mentioned, my practice is like socially engaged, or like a social practice. It's really about collaborations with people and their thoughts and opinions. So part of this, I kind of like that it's not an easy piece to read, and it can be frustrating as so much of the text is like missing. But because of that, it becomes a collaboration with kind of each viewer based on their own associations of the images and text, which kind of sparks new thoughts and expanding the piece in different directions. So much so that for me, it's kind of each thought and possible pattern created by somebody and their own associations existing only in their mind is very much still like part of this piece of work for me. So it kind of goes on to my understanding of landscape, the idea that landscape is not just a physical space, and it exists kind of in here as well as out there. And it's also split, so existing in the minds of kind of anyone who's ever thought about it. And each of these realities come together to kind of form the landscape, or form an understanding of landscape, and therefore the physical landscape. To me, the idea that kind of thoughts, conversations, and kind of like words, whether colloquial or in policy, shape landscape and an understanding of it far more than kind of machines or hands ever do. So at this stage, the project is kind of starting to split and shift. I kind of use the analogy of like rhizomes a lot within my research because of kind of the mapping of things. But for me, it's kind of becoming entangled and branching off. So almost like parts of the root systems kind of going underground and coming up over here could be split and then form their own projects. So as I say, I kind of tend to cast the net quite wide in this stage over 5 or 6 years, exploring kind of every interlinking story that kind of is coming from this one place. And then from there, allowing myself to kind of go on those journeys. So a lot of it's kind of independent, and now it's got to the stage where it's time to kind of bring other people in. I think there's a level within research where I kind of really need the interaction of other human beings and other people and their kind of thoughts and their understandings of the places that I'm kind of talking about, or particular histories and kind of that stage. So for me, the kind of project's natural trajectory is to start spending longer periods of time in some of these locations, and then working with people, holding different conversations, building new collaborators, and starting to play with some more of the materials that I've been kind of looking at. It's interesting that I didn't really think of it as being a material-led project, but due to the nature of the research and kind of the mining and the trading, suddenly there's links to kind of like ancient Phoenicia, or to Norway through wood, or to the Mersey, let alone the kind of actual global transportation of clay. So the plan is within the next year and a half to start self-led residencies and other residencies in locations, and then organising kind of collaborations with different people and working with communities. And I think that's probably like where I'm going to stop, because I realise that I'll just keep talking more and more and more. But yeah, so these are some more kind of images from the submission that I put together. And yeah, Maddie, I'm gonna I rattled on really, really quickly. I'm gonna say that that's me.
No, that was beautiful. Thank you. And yeah, looking forward to widening this giant map even further, hopefully, in our conversation this evening. So thank you for that. And yes, let's hand over to Christian, who's going to present next. Thank you, Robin.
Welcome.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Let's look at Robin. Okay, I am screen sharing, and I am now presenting. Yes. Okay. Hey everyone, I'm Chris. Chris Keeve. I'm a PhD student in geography at the University of Kentucky. And I'll just jump right in. I'm like reading off of this, so a lot of my work has to do with the things that people do or don't do with seeds, and the things that seeds may or may not do on their own. This goes back to seed work that I've been mentored with, for It's Now True Love Seeds, based in Philadelphia, back before grad school. My previous work, my master's at the University of Wisconsin, also in geography, which was much of what inspired this piece, was thinking through some of the weird geographies and spatial relations of these things called ancestral foods, or edible memory, as Jennifer Jordan has said, or historic gardens. And these alternative sorts of historical and historical, memorial, and archival relations through seed. And it focused on a few seed companies or organizations and sites that are not only thinking critically about the ways in which seeds tie into certain histories, but also allow for certain futures. And they're articulating different sorts of temporalities beyond these linear narratives. So I think a good example is here. This is a very old banner that I came across at Southern Exposure Seed Exchange in Mineral, Virginia, back in 2019. With their slogan, which they still use, the slogan "Saving the Past for the Future," right? As something that drives us, as sort of like a temporal politic that drives their seed work of thinking about like which past and which futures are kind of being manifested through this work. But my current work, I'm trying to think through some of the mobilities of things like seeds and stories across physical landscapes and digital space, how a social network analysis that holds space for the non-human social might help to reveal certain cooperative geographies of exchange and solidarity that could form through the movements of seeds and stories through these networks and communities. So kind of thinking about like the abilities of both seeds and stories, as well as the kinds of connections that form in forms of like mutual support through these networks. But also thinking about like how actual like non-human things like seeds and growing sites themselves function as part of these networks, as part of these communities. So I wrote this mustard piece for Mater, and this over on the right is just like a mustard plant from my garden this spring that is related to the mustard that I was talking about in the piece. And I should have had like an actual image from the piece by not just school. But with this, I was thinking about these not human and non-human connections and abilities across space and time, and how they might arise in errant or surprising ways, and how they might pop into or find meetings in archival spaces, or through re-articulations of archive. And really, it was just the seed catalog entry that I come across at the National Art Library in Maryland in like August of 2019, and didn't know what to do with. And over a few years, this thing's kind of snowballed and festered in interesting ways. But the nursery and seed trade catalog run by the USDA is fully digitized and searchable, mainly going back to like the late 19th century, mostly seed catalogs produced in the United States. And I ended up there a few years ago for some archival work. I was just around, I was like 2 hours away. And I wanted some encounter with the actual materialities of these catalogs. This is part of a large set of questions around materialities of memory and the political and cultural exchanges of knowledge, stories, and the genetic and ecological material of seeds. And my thinking around this collection was initially formed through the role of the state and like settler seed and garden cultures. And I had some kind of methodological orientation informed by comic studies, by which I mean like thinking through the spatial relations of representation within these catalogs on the page, as well as like the sequentiality of the catalogs themselves, right? So there's mass-produced materials that are produced iteratively every single year, right? That runs parallel to the kind of like iterative spatial relations, right, through garden cultures, season by season. But also here, for me, are certain questions of power and the role of both mass-produced seed catalogs and a state archive holding them and influencing U.S. food cultures and disciplining possible past and possible futures. So a lot of my work is about cultivated plants, heirloom seeds, but I'm always trying to hold space for the ways in which these cultivated seeds with stories and politics, very easily become feral and do things that are illegible or transgressive in the scope of various sorts of human seed politics. So here and there, I got to thinking and writing about the seeds that fall to the seedroom floor and get swept away, and then other sorts of lives. So I'm really interested in the imagery that like Robin has brought up um, uh, of the plant growing from the cracks, connecting to stories and offshoots of stories. I'm also thinking about this with what Heather's offered around these like decentralized ways of knowing and remembering and acting collectively. So kind of thinking these pieces together, I'm also interested in this different sorts of spatial relations being played around with, and the kinds of politics they might inspire from as Rob mentioned, like from landscape as a living multi-layered system, to, in my work, seed collections as loose and processual cooperative geographies, to the kinds of like organization and transgression in the space of like the zoo in Amsterdam. So in this piece, in my own work, I'm trying to think through the spatial politics that both inform and are informed by these different sorts of material relations and material geographies. But I also want to think through, and maybe other people do too, this question of the human and how it relates to non-human. Who gets to be, what it means to be human, and therefore what it means to relate to non-humans. And this comes from much of my work thinking around like non-human relations through the lens, through seeds and plants, and these arbitrary distinctions that get drawn, but also through some thinking I've been doing, especially with a colleague, Sophia Doyle, around logistics and racial capitalism, and the ways in which this planet full of like multiplicity of relations and ways of being and understanding was kind of knitted together into a single world through systems of power and control. So if we want to think a little more critically about like the large transatlantic ships that Robin mentioned, taking quote great chunks of coastline from the south of England to the Americas, right? These systems, the power dynamics of material mobility that result in these flows and routes of labor, materials, and ecologies around the world that produces different sorts of ecological systems and relations that cannot be extracted from these systems of power and violence. And I say all that because there's also the slippery that happens a lot, especially when like Anthropocene discourse, when people start talking about humans as some singular global force of destruction, right? And it tends to obscure the ways in which like much what we're facing right now is a result of specific systems of power, extraction, and exploitation that were produced and reproduced over the past several centuries by certain humans, right, against others, as well as against non-humans. So a lot of my driving questions, writing this piece, and also an invitation to think more deeply about, revolve around how to think critically about the non-human and our relations to the non-human when this category of the human is so deeply fraught, and threaded through with histories of violence and exploitation and dehumanization, etc., which is in a very roundabout way kind of what brought me to this seed catalog entry for the Broadleaf mustard, which had these stories behind it of power and control and like these kind of across species, and the abilities that kind of were behind it and that still influence it. And I will end there.
Thank you, Christian. That was amazing to listen to. Thank you. Heather is obviously 100% crucial for this conversation because the three of your ideas just are so fascinating altogether. But already in hearing both of your presentations, there are some really interesting links that just jump out straight away. I would say a lot to do with this idea of time. And seeds, you're literally both talking about seeds, which is really interesting. So perhaps we could hear from, Christian, a little bit about how you said one line in your piece about radical temporalities that are shown through seeds. So maybe it could be interesting to dive into that a little bit. It's a beautiful sentence. It's a beautiful phrase.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what I was trying to say. Yeah, I was thinking. I guess primarily, my interest in time, my own work come through kind of, or I guess like three things. There's one. I think a lot of the sort of politics that form around seeds, for good and bad, tend to follow on certain forms of like meaning making through time, right? So thinking about like a lot of discourse around historical like heirloom varieties, right, that are kind of like located in these specific places and times that's somewhere in the past, right? that are then like revived or preserved or generated, and then in the now, right? And how like that work also kind of has sort of speculative and like future oriented things, but there's still that sort of direct lineage, right? And I think I am interested in one, like the ways in which like a lot of sort of seasoned plants have these sort of like transgressive behaviors about them in which they kind of reject a lot of that meaning making, right? And in which they're really kind of like living their own lives with their own temporalities. And they kind of, so what they're then thinking through what it then looks like to kind of think with that, or think from that perspective, I guess. And I don't know, but but I am kind of really interested in a lot of the ways in which a lot of like seed-based projects and a lot of like plant-based projects kind of form these different sorts of temporal relations, right? That also kind of speak back to their own sorts of like human politics. But I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so it's like the human and the material and the seed, all of these ideas are all wrapped up in this idea of time that you're sort of breaking down through your text, and it's really interesting to read. And Robin, what about you? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's really interesting when you're talking about these kind of the histories of plants and that fact that for them it's kind of like there was just a plant existing, and for us there's like this multi-layered, really complex kind of like conversation around it. But I think it was really lovely reading your kind of piece on this idea of like the queer ancestral connection through seeds, and then from that this idea of like the haphazardness of the work, and then this idea of kind of like the relation between kind of like the rigor of research and kind of like the larger contextual with kind of the haphazard nature, and that idea of kind of like just when it was a chaotic gardener, I think there's something really beautiful in this idea of kind of like this deep research, but then also the practicality of actually growing plants, of like being in tune to the nature of kind of like what a plant actually is beyond a larger context, actually kind of like down to the fact of kind of like what it needs to survive. And I think it's really interesting, like your work kind of straddles that boundary between kind of like true rigorous research with the kind of like practicalities of actually growing. I think there's something, yeah, really beautiful within that kind of relationship that you explore very well.
Thanks. Actually thinking about a lot about what you mentioned around the like stories and offshoots of stories. And thinking about like I guess like the figure of like the offshoot and things kind of branching off in certain like unpredictable ways, right? Through like these plants that grow up from the cracks, right? They're not supposed to be there. And that are kind of like acting in ways that are kind of actively against sort of like material politics of like infrastructure, right? In a city. Which I love. And it's really thinking about like that. Just also along those lines of how there are certain like stories that are maybe illegible to us, right? But they're still no less important. But yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah, because again, like I was thinking, it's interesting this idea of I think you wrote around the idea of like the written and rewritten into the landscape as plants, and that idea of kind of like an evolving history, but as plants, like they literally are kind of rewritten, and let alone is the histories and context around them constantly changing from location to location and time between periods. But then beyond that, the plant itself is literally rejuvenating and changing, and then through our influence and external influences. But it's the context, I think, of plants from one location to another that changes so rapidly. And when you're kind of trying to discuss, you know, the history or the complexity of something, realizing that actually wherever it grows, there is a different context to it, and then a different conversation to be had. You know, a plant that grows in a crack and a plant that grows in a crack in England, or a plant that grows in a crack in America, and depending where it is, that alone compared to a garden or compared to a potted plant or those things, there's like every time you almost need a different conversation around its own situation, which I find quite interesting.
Something I find in all of your works, which is really interesting, is like this idea of I guess it comes into it as like, and actually I want to talk about this idea of control later once we've properly got into a conversation with Heather, but this idea of like at what point something is living, at what point something is not living, and like I don't know, I think Robin, you talk about this quite a lot, but also Christian, you talk about it in the sense of seeds, just in a very practical sense, how they sort of have to die, but then from the dead seed is only when you can get a new seed. Is that right? I mean, I actually I've only ever really bought seeds or grown them from a thing in my kitchen. So I was really interested in that aspect of your research into seeds as well.
Yeah, or I guess they like cease to exist, right? And like I think that's a certain point, like in order to like, and I feel like also maybe like death is like even not even like the right way to think through it, right? But some sort of like shift of form or something, in which sort of like, right, in which when seeds germinate, become seedlings, they are no longer seed, right? Like that's the seed was sort of kind of like cast off. And just because like, because it's thinking about like also my work is there's so much as it's focused on like the seed as like a very charismatic material, like as a figure. But in order to like preserve them even long term, you have to keep growing them out, which means you have to like allow your collection of seeds to break down or break away, right? Or cease to exist in order to produce plants that then produce the next iteration of those same seeds, right? Which they're not the same, but you know, and it's yeah, and I just like, and it's sort of an open question for me because I'm trying to like think through what do you meant to do with that, because there's also still have to think through with like the representational politics, right? Of like these jars of seeds in a seed room, in which like that are meant to like carry the weight of these stories and these politics, but are also just like plants who are just like existing and living their own lives, which is also why I'm so interested in like the seeds that like get swept away, right? From the seed from floor, or just kind of like get lost or fall into the cracks, right? And then can like live their own sorts of life that are not tied to certain like representational and historical weight. But yeah, and then, yeah, so thinking about like, there's a lot, I guess there's a lot, because also this work is very much about like life and living and changing, but there's like death and decay is so fundamental, right, to it. And it's so, you can't have the continuation of these lives and of these, you know, like longer term, like what even the word is, without these processes of like of dying or ceasing to exist or breaking down or transforming or decaying, right, or becoming something completely different, right? Like the material itself is then, you know, composted and, you know, reworked in the soil, and then becomes a different plant or some other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you really interestingly link that process with this idea of like memory and how memory can sort of decay and how stories are passed from person to person. And yeah, one thing that I think links both of your practices as well really interestingly is the way that you talk about thought as a system, or and yeah, I guess it also links in with this idea of like, how do we define things? So how do we define like life and death, and how do we call a seed a material, or is it made up of materials? And Robin, I think something that's interesting about your piece is how you talk about thought as well, and you talk about the brain, and you talk about thoughts being material things. They're not these like immaterial floating ideas. It's like a neuron, and these ideas have a weight, and like breaking down those definitions as well. And I'd be really interested to hear a bit more about your research into neurons and thought as well.
So I got a little bit obsessed a little while ago around the idea of thought and how I can kind of like use thought or conversation. I mean, I use conversation in the work a lot, but actually then trying to define conversation as like a medium, a material, a something. And that took me to kind of understand or start looking into the way in which thought is created. So the idea of kind of millions of neurons firing simultaneously. So the point that kind of like, I don't think people realize like how many associations those neurons are kind of creating before, like you not even realize how many there are. You might see someone in the street and you're seeing the curve of their cheek, which might remind you of your grandmother, that's reminding you of like the particular form of like a shape of an apple, that's making you think of like this color, but you're not actually consciously thinking all those things. It's just like that's happening simultaneously. And obviously, like the more associations, so I said within this kind of project, it's hard to kind of like to close down the net of those associations. The more associations you create, every time you have that thought, that association is happening. So when a project's been going for kind of 5 years, and the more you kind of look into it, how far does that cast get that net get cast? And then beyond that, when I found out that obviously like neurons firing create energy, and energy has mass. So the fact that kind of like a thought has mass, and then the idea of like a heavy thought, like the more you think about something, actually the heavier it does become, because the more associations that are created mean that it does have actually more physical weight as energy. So it's something I'm kind of like, thinking a lot about thinking, which is something I do a lot.
But this might be a good. I think we might have Heather back in the room. So if you're here, Heather, yes, she's here.
I'm in the room.
This is a really interesting moment to talk to you as well, because of this like idea of networks and systems. I think is crucial that you're in the conversation.
But I can kind of describe the way that I work with non-human networks and living systems. So I'm really interested in, I'm an artist and I work with living systems, and I'm interested in revealing these hidden behaviors that we can't normally access. And I use imaging technologies to kind of amplify things that are kind of beyond our reach, and to help us observe and understand the kind of biological and social systems. And I'm particularly interested in working with species that are superorganisms, where there's a kind of collective intelligence arising from many interactions between individuals. So I work with slime molds, with ant colonies, and collective behavior in humans as well. So I relate to much of what you were talking about in terms of kind of dialectical social practice and participatory things, and bringing other people into that process of co-inquiry with to better understand and engage with different systems, different natural systems. And so slime molds, ants and humans, different hierarchies of species. So for those of you who aren't familiar with slime mold, it's a single-celled amoeba-like organism. It creeps around the forest floor, feeding on rotting vegetation, and it or they operate as a collective. So you've got millions of nuclei sharing a cell membrane and communicating as one through chemical signaling. Next slide. They are nomadic and very curious. So this is slime mold escaping from one petri dish in my studio into another. Next slide. And I create environments for them to navigate, and I intervene as I capture their growth behaviors through time-lapse photography. At a top speed of 1 centimetre an hour, slime mold is not something that we can perceive without intervention. And some of the most interesting growth behavior happens when the slime mold is hungry and desperately looking for food. Next slide. My studies are a form of practical inquiry. So I start often with questions of how does it navigate its terrain? What happens when I introduce two genetically identical slime molds? How will they interact? Will they become one? Will they fuse? Let's have a look. A little moment of hesitation, and then the slime mold forms this beautiful network transmitting information across the whole cell. And it's this collective strategy that enables it to optimize networks, navigate efficiently, and learn from its environment. So it's considered to have a primitive form of intelligence without having any sensory organs and without a brain, not a single neuron to its name. Next slide, please. Another intelligent organism which operates as a superorganism is the ant colony. On an individual basis, ants are pretty stupid, but collectively they form a global intelligence transmitting information through complex communication mechanisms. generating knowledge for the colony that can also be passed down through generations. Next slide, please. Working in the field, I observe ants in their natural habitat and I intervene. If you press the next slide, it should play. So I intervene with the natural systems, a series of offerings or interruptions to try and understand their behaviour and sort of draw out the ant behaviour. So this is some food offerings, some honey-coated bread that the ants find and tell their sisters to come and help them, and they break it down gradually and take it into the nest site. So this kind of allows me, working in the field allows me to observe these systems in their natural habitat, but the field is messy. So I also work in the lab quite a lot. Next slide, please. And I often work in collaboration with scientists. So this is during a residency in the Swarm Lab in New Jersey Institute of Technology. The Swarm Lab is looking at swarm intelligence across all sorts of systems and species, from slime molds and ants to humans and robotics and programming. And I was interested in working with the ants to see if to use their kind of foraging behavior and their pheromone trail formation to capture their movements. So if you go on to the next slide. So this is a film made up of 12,000 photographs. It's taken over a 3-hour period, working with 1,000 foraging New Jersey pavement ants. And rather than looking at the individual ants, I was interested in the global perspective, how trails were established over time within the group. So what you see here is a composite of images showing the behaviour of the mass as territory is mapped and food sources found and lost. Everything you see here is in white is ant, the colony as an image making system. And working with imaging technologies allows me to manipulate biological representations, to play with time, to play with scale, to reveal or to conceal processes of life. Next slide. At the moment, I'm in Amsterdam. I'm currently a resident in the Machine Wilderness Project at Artist Zoo. And this is a project exploring the relationship between nature and technology, speculating on how technology could benefit other than human life. And I'm based in the gorilla house, but I'm not working directly with the gorillas. Next slide. But the unseen and uninvited creatures who live in the undergrowth, in the enclosure plantation. So I'm focusing on the ants that live next to the gorillas. Next. So I've been creating observation stations to draw out the ants from the undergrowth, creating a stage for people to observe their behaviour. And next, and it's not only me who is curious about the ant activity in the undergrowth. I think the gorillas are kind of slightly curious as to what I'm looking at and why I'm not looking at them. Next slide, please. And looking at the ants does mean not looking at the gorillas, which is quite challenging because they are very attention-seeking creatures. But they form a really interesting juxtaposition because they're two very social creatures, but operating at vastly different scales. Next. So this isn't a solitary activity. I'm inviting others to join in the observations, informal conversations with visitors to the zoo, life drawing workshop, inviting people to observe and draw from their observations, which Maddie attended back in April. Next. Can you see my finger if I raise? Oh no, I've also got the thing. Can you? Okay, I'll do that because we've got quite a few little things. So yes, people drawing from their observations, very simple imaging technology to mediate into ant world of magnifying devices. I'm just allowing a little bit of access to ant scale. The results from the life drawing workshop were really interesting and very varied. People tuning in to different aspects of antness, the essence of ant, energy and chaos, the constant movement of the colony, motion tracking, so identifying which kind of direction they're going in, or the kind of sci-fi fear of the big, hairy, scary ant. And then the last one, which is my backdrop, very detailed little typology of individual ants. And the last slide. So this is the main part of the residency took place in April, but my studies were rudely interrupted by a COVID infection, another kind of uninvited guest. So I returned this week and I'm completing my fieldwork. And the results for the whole Machine Wilderness project, which is 7 artists who've been exploring the relationship between nature and technology at Artist Zoo. All 7 projects will be presented this Friday in the new Groot Museum in Amsterdam, which is next to the Artist Zoo. So if you are in Amsterdam on Friday, drop in between 11 and 5, meet the artists and see all the fieldwork and research that has been done. Thank you.
I'm really glad that we got that working, because that was well worth the wait. That was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for bearing with me and being a very good next slide person.
Those videos of slime mold are absolutely incredible. They're amazing. How did you record those?
It's time-lapse photography. So it's capturing an image at regular intervals. And depending on how frequently you take a photograph, different characteristics reveal themselves, because the slime mold has a pulsing mechanism, which is the way that it transmits information across this mast cell. And that has its own internal rhythm. So if you capture at different rates, you can see that kind of pulsing. You can actually see the information being distributed through the cell.
It's amazing, and it's amazing considering the conversation that we've been having about this idea of how things are distributed. And I mean, Robin obviously has just mentioned the rhizome, but seeing that slime mold, you really get that sense of a thing that has no start or end point, no central point. I mean, it's literally just, it's incredible. I don't understand how it hasn't covered the entire world. It's amazing to watch. But it's really interesting thinking about your practice in terms of how you work with others. And actually, I think all of you have this in your practices in a way. And yeah, it might be interesting to talk about how other people come into this conversation for you. So maybe Heather, if you started that.
Okay. I think the way I work with all organisms, human and other, similar in that it's a kind of an invitation for a kind of interaction, or with humans it's dialogue, and bringing people into the inquiry. So it's about asking questions and sharing knowledge, and hopefully creating possibilities for discovery in others. So today I was back in the gorilla house with the ants, and just the act of looking. These are very simple devices, and I'm looking, but then other people are just naturally drawn to curiosity of what I'm looking at, and then conversations evolve. And so I had a great conversation with an 8-year-old about he's absolutely fascinated with watching ants, and kind of he does something similar and gives them little bits of food and sees them scurrying away, and these beautiful little moments. And I purposely work with creatures that are either little understood or little valued in the hierarchy of species. And so I think that just bringing humans into that kind of leveling of the hierarchy, and revealing these great intelligences in other creatures and other forms of intelligence that maybe get us to redefine what we consider to be intelligence.
Yeah, that really comes out with all of the living systems that you work with.
Can I just say, I loved being slime mold. The kind of like performative workshop was just like phenomenal. I think the idea of kind of like taking your research and understanding of kind of like these non-human systems, but then applying it to humans, and something in like I think you said about kind of like the failure within it, and the fact that it's like destined to fail, but within that makes maybe something people don't feel immediately able to access so accessible. And just kind of like, I think that kind of element that I can see across kind of, I think everyone's work here, is that idea of kind of like bringing people in and meeting them where they are and finding that kind of like a way for humans to engage in these conversations. But I was just wondering kind of like what was learned. I think you used the word for like practical philosophy, and that idea of actually kind of like bringing people into the inquiry. I think there's something really beautiful within that.
Yeah, I think there's something about, acting first and then unpacking that experience and bringing questions to it. And so whether it's working with the material of an organism, or working with it kind of metaphorically, or modeling behaviors in a slightly absurd way, it's kind of setting up an experience that can then be kind of deciphered or interpreted, and it's very much very open to interpretation. One thing that I love about the slime mold is it's a very malleable metaphor of, for networks and collective cohesion and non-centralized decision making, and we can kind of, there's many ways that you can tune into it, and many other kind of analogous systems that we can look at across scales, kind of human level or organizational level, as well as many other natural systems.
Yeah, I love that idea of kind of the idea of maybe not overplaying something, having an idea, doing it, and then being like, let's see what comes of this, and then we can reshift and rework our understanding of what we're doing. And I think it's something I try and do in a lot of like the larger workshops that I do, is that same thing of like, I think one of the things I was looking at last year was kind of stone circles as civic spaces, and exploring that idea of kind of like the civic role of actually building stone circles. I couldn't build an actual one, but we built a willow, and that was the idea of basically I invited, I think it was 10 people came along. We had hundreds of meters of willow, 3 days, and everyone arrived thinking they were going to be like instructed how to make something, and I was like, no, the workshop is called How to Build a Stone Circle. We are now going to figure this out over the next 3 days together. And kind of something that I thought was quite flippant in its kind of project actually led to so many more realizations in other aspects of my work, due to that exact thing of kind of like, let's do something and then analyze and play with that thought afterwards. I can see you nodding along, Christian, so I think.
Oh yeah, I love that idea so much. Yeah, and I guess I don't know what I can offer here, but I'm thinking about so a lot of my own work around just like being someone who like is doing work about seed networks, and is also in it, right? Who's also doing that work of growing. Because something I'm trying to figure out, I guess, in which like it's my I guess like all my research is like participant observation technically, but most of it is like me alone in the field, right? That's like what it means to be in a network with other humans, which is also kind of really fascinating. But right, I was thinking about something else around, because I love what both of you are bringing up, or with like kind of doing and then like analyzing collectively, and then letting that like then inform what the next step is, what the next iteration is. Which I am like at the very beginning stages of trying to even put together as a project, but I'm really just like fascinated with that, and I'm also wondering, both of you, kind of like what that kind of looks like. If you want to talk a little bit more about what that kind of looks like in a practical sense, right? Around bringing like whoever shows up, right, into the actual process of like analysis, right, of the quote unquote data, or whatever's going on.
Yeah, but is yours similar to this project in the zoo at the moment? Is it people invited to come into the space, or is it anyone that kind of walks past? Because I kind of do both. I both invite specific groups, or it can just be like in public spaces. But I think I do both, depending on kind of what the thing is.
Yeah, I'm the same. So it depends on the situation. The project at the zoo is, people are walking through, they're observing the animals, and I'm kind of intervening, or sort of interrupting that normal pattern of observation. So it's very spontaneous and open.
I think there's definitely things to be learned in both situations. For sure. When you work in public spaces and you're doing kind of like interventions in those spaces, it's kind of like learning quite quickly that kind of like you may have an understanding of what it is you're looking to get out of that, or what you're looking to do, and then very quickly realizing that that may not, probably will never be what's actually going to happen, and allowing yourself kind of like that that to just dissipate immediately.
That's the idea of control, which is really interesting in all of this conversation, is you can guide something and you can have an idea for where you want something to go, but at the end of the day, as soon as other people or organisms or any system or thing gets involved, that's kind of the beauty of it, is we can't really control it. And these outcomes would be so much less soulful and interesting if they were fully controlled by one person. It's all about this multiplicity and this layering of different processes that really speaks to all of these projects. And I remember Heather talking to you about control in a way, and you speaking about how there's this idea of almost like aimlessness, which I found really interesting. And I think that's something that we are sort of conditioned almost not to be, is aimless. It's like there has to be a point of something. And although we are about to run out of time, it could be interesting just to talk about that tiny bit before we have to go.
Yeah, so I think relinquishing control is really interesting and important. So I describe what I do as creating the conditions for hopefully something interesting to happen, but I can't control whether it does or not. And so I'm really interested in the principles of emergence, how from very kind of simple elements, complex, unpredicted things emerge. And I don't want to control the outcome. I want to be surprised by what happens, but that means also facing disappointment when things don't happen. I don't know if other people want to say about questions of control.
So in Christian's text, there was an interesting element of control when you were speaking about the kudzu plant, and this you can't. That was a real example of something that cannot be controlled.
Yes, I am like obsessed with kudzu from a distance. I think it's absolutely fascinating. As an example of like this, these seeds that were kind of introduced to these landscapes in the U.S. South, right, with the purpose of like economic, resource generation or economic gain, and then ended up being one of the most iconic examples, right, of an invasive species, right, that's then reworking the landscape in all these ways, and kind of just like kind of thinking through like all these, just all the kind of like machinations, right, from just like random people, but also from individual states, right, that are trying to like do something about this, right, that is then this sort of vegetation that then is kind of like runs rampant and must kind of like be reined in, which is also kind of why I'm so fascinated by it. And also, as I say this, like I often like wax poetic about like plants being transgressive and like doing whatever they want, and like gardens as like these kind of chaotic spaces. But later today I'm gonna go down to my growing sites and like trellis tomatoes and like pull weeds and like put up fencing. Like these are all like forms of like material like guidance and like trying to like maintain the site as the way it's supposed to be, the way that I want it to be, right? So I guess trying to think through like these, like kind of like what it means to relate to these very transgressive, like non-human beings, but at the same time thinking about like my own like needs and wants, right? And kind of how oftentimes in this work, those are always in tension. And also how like my own needs and wants relate to other people's needs and wants, other people's politics around what they're doing. But yeah.
Oh, thank you. I really want to carry on this conversation. I'm super heartbroken that it's 7:05 now, and I know that it's not fair to keep it going because we all have other commitments. Christian, it's the middle of the day for you, and I know you have meetings still today. But I honestly feel like we've literally just scratched the surface, and there's so many more. Yeah, there's so much more for this. There's so many more directions that this could go in. So I'm really, really sad to cut it so short, and hopefully we can all have the opportunity to speak again at some point and continue this conversation, and I will find a way to make that happen. But thank you guys so much for joining this evening, and sorry today for you, Christian. It's been absolutely lovely talking to you, and thank you everyone for tuning in to watch as well. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your days, and please, everyone who hasn't yet, come and visit us at Mater.Digital, and we have one more event tomorrow, 5 till 6 p.m. UK time, which will also be available on Eventbrite. And yeah, huge thank you guys for that conversation.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Really.
Thank you. And I'm glad we got the presentation working in the end, Heather.
Yes.
Very good.